This is Puerto Rico. It's a small tropical island which lies roughly 1,000 miles off the coast of Florida. Surrounded by Caribbean countries like the Dominican Republic and Jamaica, in many ways Puerto Rico is very similar to its neighbours. However, unlike these other countries, since the late 1800s, Puerto Rico has been part of the United States of America, as something called an unincorporated territory. What this means is that Puerto Rico is neither a state of America, but neither can it make its own decisions. And this is something which has defined the entire modern history of the island. You would naturally assume that being tied to the wealthiest nation in the world would have made the island significantly richer. But in fact, this special relationship has actually had the opposite effect and kept Puerto Rico poor for more than 100 years. Treated as an economy of its own right, Puerto Rico would be the second largest in the Caribbean, narrowly behind the Dominican Republic. And on a per capita basis, that is, divided by the population, it stands at around $41,000, which for context is higher than many developed European nations. But unlike these European countries, life in Puerto Rico for many looks like this. Puerto Rico clearly faces a checklist of problems. Economic depression, a shrinking population, debt crisis and bankruptcy, natural disasters, and government mismanagement, to name a few. Residents of Puerto Rico are US citizens, meaning they are subject to federal laws and eligible for the draft. But they do not enjoy the same political rights as their fellow Americans. And without any say in the laws that govern it, Puerto Rico has for decades been neglected by Washington. Even America's poorest state, Mississippi, is still significantly richer than Puerto Rico. And when comparing median incomes, the picture becomes even more stark, as people earn less than half than their counterparts on the mainland. Despite being notably poorer, Puerto Rico receives significantly less funding and financial support than states of the same size. Mississippi and Puerto Rico both roughly have 3 million residents, yet Puerto Rico receives 10 times less Medicaid funding, despite having a population in far greater need of support, as almost half of the island lives in poverty, a figure which is nearly 5 times greater than the mainland USA. This is just one of the many ways that the US deliberately exercises its power over the territory to prevent its economic success. And of course, this has its consequences. Between 2004 and 2017, economic output dropped by 14%, meaning if Puerto Rico was measured as a country, that decline would rank among the worst in recent history for a nation not at war. In fact, the situation is so bad that in the last 5 years, more people have left the country than at any time since the Great Puerto Rican Migration after World War II. This is a theme which pops up across all of America's overseas territories, all of which are significantly poorer than the mainland. However, of all these territories, Puerto Rico seems to have it worse, and decades of mismanagement have driven the country to its knees. So how did it come to be that a nation with such potential has been held back and restricted by America? And why has America deliberately kept Puerto Rico poor? After all, it's not like keeping Puerto Rico down has benefited the average American. The majority of people in the US still live paycheck to paycheck. With the situation only worsening after COVID and scathing inflation has decimated people's usual strategies for building wealth. No wonder the Bank of America has just reported with nearly 3/4 of wealthy younger Americans saying stocks and bonds alone can't deliver above average returns. The future of wealth is increasingly running through more alternative investments. One of the platforms at the forefront of this movement is today's sponsor, Masterworks. Masterworks is an alternative investment platform for investors to diversify into blue-chip contemporary art without needing millions of dollars or art expertise. They've distributed back a total of over $60 million in investor proceeds across their 23 exits, with previously exited paintings from artists like Banksy, Basquiat, Warhol, among many others, including an $8 million Basquiat sale that occurred just last month. Masterworks platform offers blue-chip paintings to investors in the forms of shares, and then aims to sell those paintings again for a net return to investors, as they have for those 23 exits so far. Masterworks is nearing $1 billion of invested capital, and some offerings have the potential to sell out quickly. So if you're interested in learning more and want priority access, you can use the QR code on screen now, or my link in the description. Past sales and previous offering demand are not indicative of future results. All investing involves risk. See important regulation and disclosures at masterworks.com/CD. Puerto Rico was not always part of the United States. In fact, in terms of its overall history, this is considered a relatively modern phenomenon. Occupation, however, is a theme which runs throughout almost all of the island's history, and before the Americans, it was the Spanish. They named it Puerto Rico, or Rich Port, due to its natural harbour in San Juan. And for nearly 400 years, the island's economy was driven by the forced labour of natives and African slaves, producing sugarcane, tobacco, and coffee for export to Europe. That was until around the end of the 1800s, when slavery was brought to an end. It was also around this time that the United States' interest in Puerto Rico began to peak. The island was seen as a place of strategic importance, being a central location in the Caribbean to protect shipping lanes, and also being near to Cuba, both of which were seen as valuable to the United States. So over the course of a short but violent war, the United States and Spain fought it out for the island, and the United States won. Spain gave control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the US, expanding America's empire. However, unlike the Philippines, Puerto Rico never gained its full independence from Spain or the US. Instead, it's one of the oldest remaining colonies in the world. Now that Puerto Rico was essentially in American hands, they went about setting up things like a government, but more importantly, they implemented federal US law that was imposed upon the island. This not only limited the island's autonomy, but it allowed America to impose trade and tax policies which were favourable to them, but often not advantageous to the economic growth of Puerto Rico. From the offset, it was clear that Puerto Rico was going to be used to service the mainland, as opposed to operating in its own interests. So in order to make the most of this island, the American government looked to make use of its advantages. One thing that Puerto Rico had massive potential for was sugar farming. Firstly, its climate was perfectly suited to the production of the crop, and it had been making it for centuries. And for the US, it made much more sense to move production to Puerto Rico, as it was far cheaper than existing production in Louisiana. Puerto Rico's potential for sugar production was exploited by US companies, displacing local landowners and turning the island into a monoculture economy reliant on this single crop. And in the early 20th century, laws like the Jones Act of 1917 further burdened Puerto Rico. While granting US citizenship and establishing a Puerto Rican Senate, it required that all cargo between US ports be transported on US-built, owned and crewed vessels. This significantly increased shipping costs, making goods more expensive for Puerto Ricans who continued to earn low wages. This focus on sugar production continued for some time, throughout the Great Depression of the 1930s and up to the Second World War, where its location once again proved useful to fend off German U-boats, and thousands of Puerto Rican soldiers also enlisted in the military. But after World War II, this is where we really see America get involved with the working of Puerto Rico's economy. Up until this point, it had primarily been used as a cheap place to grow and export sugar, and almost half of the jobs on the island were based in agriculture. Despite being immensely profitable to this point, living conditions were still some of the worst in the Caribbean because of this, and US policymakers decided that something needed to be done. I mean, yes, it would be good to give people better living conditions, but also when people live better, they are less likely to try and overthrow you from power. And what they did was something called Operation Bootstrap. Essentially, this was a series of policies designed to turn Puerto Rico from an agricultural to an industrial economy. And in some ways, it's still going on to this day, but with a catch. You see, instead of the benefit going to Puerto Ricans, these policies were designed to benefit wealthy business owners of American companies. So how did it work? Companies which moved to Puerto Rico would gain a number of tax advantages and also receive subsidies. And this, combined with an abundance of English-speaking, educated workers whose costs were much cheaper than mainland America, meant that many manufacturers started to flock to Puerto Rico to set up factories. Despite what was to come later, this initially boosted the island's economy, and from 1950 to 1980, Puerto Rico's per capita gross national product grew by nearly tenfold, and disposable income and educational attainment rose. And while income levels were lower than those on the mainland, they were significantly higher than in the rest of the Caribbean. All of this was another PR win for America, as they could brand Puerto Rico as a successful capitalist and democratic counterpoint to communist Cuba. This capitulates America's involvement well. While some benefit was passed to the citizens, it was mainly designed to benefit US companies, and much of the economic benefit of these policies didn't reach Puerto Ricans. The economic boom was also unsustainable, relying heavily on protective policies sheltering the island from the rest of the world, whilst also not allowing Puerto Rico to build up its own industries. So when these protections diminished in the 1970s, Puerto Rico lost its competitive edge. But the US recognised this, and not wanting to completely abandon their economy, the government once again came up with another tax measure to make investment and business operations more lucrative in Puerto Rico. Simply put, this was a change to the US tax code called Section 936, which meant American companies were able to either partially or completely avoid paying federal income taxes for their Puerto Rican subsidiaries, as long as they sent out their earnings in dividends, essentially allowing them to keep all their money without paying any tax. And it would work something like this. Let's take a pharmaceutical company like Johnson & Johnson. They could take the intellectual property of one of their products, like Remicade, and transfer it to Puerto Rico. They could then manufacture the drugs on the island for way less money than before, then sell them at high prices on the mainland to customers. And what is better is that they could bring all the profits back to the mainland tax-free. This seems great, right? And for companies it was. They could take many of the patents for their most valuable products and transfer them to the island. And this was highly lucrative, as in 1987 alone, pharmaceutical companies received benefits amounting to $1.3 billion, which was roughly 5% of Puerto Rico's entire economy at the time. So once again, Puerto Rico saw a massive influx of investment. Other industries also made use of this model. But yet again, we can see the benefit deliberately being diverted away from Puerto Ricans and toward big American business. And often, many of the industries which moved over did not provide the same broad-based employment as before. And so with this boom especially, Puerto Ricans felt even less benefit. What perhaps made all of this worse is that Puerto Rico's economy, and by design many of the jobs of its citizens, were allowed to grow with a critical flaw. That is, a dependency on the US and its policies. This meant that any changes to the laws which made it favourable to operate in Puerto Rico would be devastating, as the island had very few companies and employers of its own. And this is a disaster which would start to turn to reality in 1996, when the Clinton administration decided to revoke the act across a 10-year period. By 2006, the federal policies that had supported the Puerto Rican economy, high external tariffs, oil import quotas, and tax-free repatriation of offshore profits were all gone. And what happened next was devastating. On an unprecedented scale, investment and companies began to pull out of Puerto Rico. To make matters worse, just 2 years later, the real estate bubble burst, which caused Puerto Rico's economy to collapse. The island was already in a bad way, and once again, its status as a US dependency made things worse. As it wasn't a state, it could not file for bankruptcy protection. As it was not a country either, it couldn't contact an institution like the IMF for a bailout. Instead, they had to deal with it themselves, and implemented austerity measures which have cut jobs and led to a decline in public services. You see, unlike most other states, Puerto Rico never sustained a strong economy on the back of manufacturing or producing goods. So when its main competitive advantages were taken away, a crisis ensued. This has taken shape in three main ways: job losses, brain drain, and public debt. As companies continued to leave Puerto Rico, many jobs, especially in once lucrative industrial sectors, have disappeared. And compared to the US, jobs in Puerto Rico have continued to decline even after the recovery from the 2008 financial crash. What makes all of this worse is that since Puerto Rico is not a US state, it leaves the island's residents more exposed to poverty than US citizens on the mainland, as they do not receive the same tax benefits which supplement the incomes of poor Americans. And these benefits would be substantial for many Puerto Ricans. On the mainland, a family with 2 children earning the Puerto Rican median income of $20,000 would receive around $5,500 a year in tax credits, an amount which would make a massive impact on the families across the island who are struggling to get by. And although Puerto Rico participates to varying degrees in other federal safety net programs, including Medicaid and Medicare, it's estimated that Puerto Rico received between $1.7 billion and $5.4 billion less in annual federal benefits than it would have done if it were a state. Exclusion from these programs, of course, has a devastating effect on the living standards of Puerto Ricans, as nearly half of the island's population live in poverty. Poor provision of public services like transport and electricity infrastructure are also contributing to another major problem: brain drain. More than any other time in the territory's history, its skilled, young individuals, the lifeblood of its economy, are leaving the country for better conditions on the mainland. Since its population peaked in 2005, it's been steadily declining. And this issue is twofold, as not only are young people leaving, but those who remain are getting older. An older population not only means less tax revenue, but far greater expenditure on social programs like healthcare, an effect which will be even more than other countries due to Puerto Rico's high level of poverty. In order to keep the lights on since the financial crash, the Puerto Rican government has had to continue borrowing to try and keep track of these services. Because of this, Puerto Rico has built up an unsustainable level of debt, one which is around 4 times higher than the usual level of a US state. It's true that this is partly from poor management from the Puerto Rico government, but also from a woeful lack of provision from the mainland. To put into perspective how poorly Puerto Rico has been treated, over half of its citizens receive Medicaid or CHIP assistance. But when compared to a state like Mississippi, which also has high poverty rates, Puerto Rico receives significantly less federal funding or social spending. As a result, the government has had to divert funds away from other important areas of the economy in order to fund these citizens, notably social programs to prevent people falling into poverty, essentially creating a vicious cycle as one causes the other. Over recent decades, dwindling tax revenues and escalating debts in other sectors have pushed Puerto Rico to rely on borrowing to maintain the solvency of its Medicaid program. This is also extended to most of its public services, as its electricity system, even though in woeful condition, is more than $8 billion in debt. As the government has continued to borrow, hedge funds looking for fiscal windfalls have been happy to oblige on extending huge loans with predatory interest rates to the Puerto Rican government. These same hedge funds were backers of changes on the island's constitution that mandated the local government to first pay debt relief before continuing to fund schools, energy, and other vital public services. And unfortunately, this focus on debt payments above all else will only help to exacerbate the current vicious cycle of outmigration, with the only certainty being more pain for Puerto Rico in the future. It could be easy to argue that this poor mismanagement and borrowing has led to its current day position, but the truth is that the US government also bears a great deal of responsibility for the island's plight. When federal policies that aided Puerto Rico's economic development were repealed, no enduring replacements were put in place. Washington largely ignored Puerto Rico until it was clear that the island was in severe financial distress and would default on its debt without the protections granted to US municipalities when they file for bankruptcy. And it looks like it's going to be keeping the same way for many years to come.